Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Collective VC podcast. Today, we're joined by Etienne Variot. He's working in the regenerative agriculture space, specifically on a company called Rize. So, Etienne, over to you if you want to just correct that introduction or embellish it, add anything to that.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver, for having me for the podcast. Short introduction. I'm an engineer by background. I worked for 5 years in finance, and then after that, I wanted to connect at a deeper level with some of my personal interests and personal concerns, and that's how I started 5 years ago to go along the entrepreneurship route. And the topic that I was keen to explore was sustainable development, and that's how we ended up with my initial co-founder founding Rize, which aims at finding solutions for sustainable agriculture.
So, when it comes to talking about sustainable agriculture, there's a lot of buzzwords. People don't really understand the difference, for example, just between someone saying they're working on something that's sustainable or they're working on something that's regenerative. So, could you maybe clear up a little bit of the distinction there and how you really decided in which area you wanted to work in?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. There are several ways you can do sustainable agriculture. There are several problems around agriculture at the moment. Just to name a few: greenhouse gas emissions, the use of chemistry and the level of pollution, the loss of biodiversity, the loss of soil health, etc., etc. So there are different ways of sustainable agriculture. Just to name two that are really known at the moment: organic. It's namely less chemistry or as little chemistry as possible, and regenerative agriculture that focuses on regenerating soil health as well as protecting biodiversity, which is also called, to a certain extent, conservation agriculture for soil conservation or agroecology. There are several words, but all of those concepts are kind of defining different directions, and most of them are reducing, are having several co-benefits in terms of climate, biodiversity, pollution, etc., etc.
So the underlying theme between all of them is just reimagining how humans interact with farmland, I imagine.
Yes, that's
Sure.
that's correct. We are focusing on reducing the climate impact of agriculture, protecting biodiversity, and protecting soil health for our long-term security. And the agriculture current that corresponds to that is mostly regenerative agriculture, but in many ways it interacts with organic agriculture, for instance, or other ways of agriculture. And we are not set on specifically regenerative agriculture, although this is the main type of agriculture that we're promoting.
How do analytics play into this whole thing? How do we need to A, collect them, and then also B, how are they even valuable to us when we're looking at creating more sustainable systems, food systems?
That's a very good question. Analytics is actually the starting point. If you want to drive any kind of project, and in particular, any kind of environmental-based project, the first thing that you need to do is to understand the problem at the data level, at the analytical level, and creating a clear diagnostic as the first step as a project to reduce the environmental footprint of a farm or any kind of other business is extremely important. And this is the starting point of most of environmental projects. Yes. So extremely important. This is the starting point. And then obviously monitoring the evolution of that impact, the reduction of, for instance, the greenhouse gas emissions at the farm level, understanding the breakdown per crops, per plot, per practices is extremely important to drive change and to identify the different levers that can be implemented to keep improving and make sure we do improve.
I'd like you just to talk a little bit about some of the actual processes that at your company, either via Regen Insight or its, would you say, parent company Rize, in the sense that you're actually working on actionable ways for farmland and food production processes to track what they do in a more sustainable way and work out better practices in terms of conservation of biodiversity. How does that actually occur? And how have you managed to turn that into a viable business model? Because I think lots of people out there are really interested in doing things that are good for the planet, good for our species, but also, can make them a living and potentially even, become a scalable business that can be venture backed and become a legacy.
Yeah, that's a really wide question. So I'm going to start by explaining what we do at Rize and Regen Insight, which are two brands operating at the same time for different types of solution for the farmers and the farming ecosystem. But basically, we started initially 4 years ago with Rize. And on one side, we wanted to find solution for the farmers. So we are mostly focused on farm transition to regenerative agriculture, to sustainable agriculture, to low carbon agriculture. This is what we are focusing on. These are our primary clients. And we identified that farmers, when we launched, had no relevant or satisfactory tools, infrastructures to be able to reliably measure and monitor their environmental footprint, and in particular, their carbon footprint. This was one problem. Basically, what kind of practices should be implemented on my farm? This decision-making was a problem. A second problem was the administration burden borne by farms if they want to demonstrate that they have sustainable farming practices in place. And the last one, and the most important one, is if you want to implement regenerative agriculture, you need new equipment, you need training, you need to rethink the way you farm. And maybe I'll explain later what regenerative agriculture is on the ground and what it entails. But basically, you need financing. Those are additional costs, potential reduction in yields, potential risk in the short term. So you need some financing, and this is one of the most important barriers for the farmers. How do they finance their transition to regenerative agriculture?
Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I was recently at a climate impact conference and there was a roundtable on regenerative agriculture. Is it the farmers, they have to potentially miss out on money because they have to let the acreage sort of rest every now and then to sort of let the soil recover itself, or they do on and off seasons, or how does that work?
This is already to a certain extent happening at the farm. It's not going to be this. It's going to be mostly that you're going to move from a heavy mechanization and chemistry based agriculture to a more natural ways to do agriculture, and the soil will be the primary production factor. So rehabilitating, restoring the health of the soils, which is going to require to change the way you fertilize, the way you farm, replicating some natural processes in nature. Just to give a few examples, for instance, the use of cover crops. So after harvest, instead of leaving your soil bare, completely empty until you see it for the next season, so maybe around 6 months where the soil is just exposed to the sun, will be degraded. You might use some chemistry to ensure no weeds are coming to your plots. This is extremely detrimental to the soil health. While instead, if you plant new crops, which are called cover crops, to cover your soil, that are going to produce biomass, that are going to protect the different ecosystems in your soils. And basically, when you're going to seed for the next season, you make sure that those plants that you've planted are not going to compete. So basically, they are going to die when you're going to plant for the next season, and you just destroy them and let them on the ground. And all of that organic matter, or all that biomass, will actually feed into the ground for not only carbon, but if you use, for instance, legumes, are also going to provide nitrogen, and in turn are going to help you use less nitrogen-based fertilizers. So that's one example, but it's all about how can I maximize the impact of my soil as being my main production factor, instead of mechanization and instead of chemistry. So this, for the farmers, is a risk, because this is changing the way they have been farming and that have been working. This might, in the short term, in the long term, their yields are going to augment, but they might decrease for a period. Everyone says for 5 years, they have a -10, -20% in yields. And well, those cover crops, you need to seed. So it's some additional operations, it's some training, it's some costs for the seeds, possibly different equipments, etc., etc. And all of these require for the farms to find financing for their project.
I've been thinking about like getting to the core of communication between two stakeholders, in this case, whether it's a farmer and somebody like yourself, or even just in a broader human context, like dense urban metropolitan areas who get all of their food from, I don't know, surrounding areas, or even it's shipped in from overboard. How do we like bridge the divide when it comes to communicating like these sort of species problems, which is a sustainable food system, between two people who live like really incredibly separate lives? And I also feel like farmers have had like a really short end of the deal for a long time. Like we don't pay a lot for our food. Some of our supply chains, end up seeing farmers making not a lot of money whatsoever. How do we then convince them to potentially, reduce their yields even further with that long-term goal of, that long-term mindset of soil quality preservation?
Yeah, well, there are two questions within your question. The first one is about our current society and the fact that we in urban areas, and although I grew up in the countryside, I've never really been brought in the farming ecosystem. So from the bus going to school, I used to see the cows, but that's how much I knew about agriculture initially. And in cities, we are completely disconnected from the reality of what we eat. And I really feel like in the past years, and especially since COVID, people are more interested to understand where the food comes from, reconnect with nature, with agriculture, and there is a stronger interest for agriculture, which I think in the early 2000 years, agriculture was really a different sector that really in cities we didn't really care that much about. So it's really important to reconnect with what we eat. And I've seen that there is a lot of promotion from farmers who feel that they are not being correctly understood by, I would say, the main population, and in particular urban populations. Communication from the government, communication from food brands, etc., etc. And I think regenerative agriculture, which to a certain extent is a nice marketing tool to reconnect people with what they eat. That was the first part of your question, and I don't remember what was the first one.
Well, it kind of plays in nicely as with what you just said. Is obviously the benefits of regenerative agriculture are clear, but if we are asking them to make a financial sacrifice, I guess that's a nice segue into some of the work you're doing on the side of making it financially viable. Otherwise, these people are just going to say no, and then it's a brick wall, and that's an obstacle we need to overcome.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, the situation is slightly more complex than this, because today farmers who own their own farm, they own their soils. This is their production area. They are starting to understand that the estate, the land value, is also connected to how productive it is, and that actually in the long term, switching from a soil-based growing system is beneficial economically because it reduces the amount of mechanization, it increases the yields, it decreases the expenses in chemistry-based products, fertilizers. And farmers are starting to understand this. So they are interested, and they're also, like most of us, also concerned about the environment. So although 5 years ago when we started, with regenerative agriculture was completely new in Europe and in France, and we had to explain to everyone what were the benefits. Now benefits are clearly understood by the farmers, by the farming ecosystem in general. And the main question is, one, how do we measure it? How do we produce quality data? And second, how do we finance? How do we bridge the financing need? And this is, to a certain extent, it connects with the first half of your question. This is a societal question because in the past, we expected farmers to produce our food. And now we are expecting farmers to produce our food, but also to produce some what we call environmental ecosystemic services. And who should pay for that service that is being rendered to the general society? And this is kind of the question that we are trying to solve through different business models.
Well, I guess it's almost a philosophical or moral question, but I guess it probably kind of resulting in a higher quality end product, right? So there wouldn't need to be that much of a premium in the sense that the customer doesn't actually know what they're paying for. Because if you look at paying for something like organic food or even something that's grown locally, you might be paying a little bit more. So I'm curious, what's the sort of margins we're looking at? What's the pricing difference going to actually be?
The first problem is to collectively define what regenerative agriculture is. And I think the best way to define it is by providing some clear and shareable KPIs that we can trace along the supply chain, which is extremely hard because you have one farmer that is producing so many different crops at the same time, so many different agriculture products that will serve for different food companies with different intermediaries, potentially processing plants in between, et cetera, before it hits the supermarkets. And it's extremely hard to trace the full food value chain with, like, for instance, carbon intensity, to be able to drive the carbon intensity and to be able to display on the final product what's the carbon intensity of my cereal bar or of my apple or whatever I'm having, and especially for transformed and processed products. But I think, like organic, the first step will be to put in place some regenerative agriculture supply chains and slowly build the traceability system and infrastructure to bring those KPIs in terms of carbon first and second biodiversity, water in the long term, to bring that to the final consumer. But this is going to take decades to have a clear traceability system all along the food chain for most products. It's going to be, I think, accessible for products that are not being processed, like apples, but it's going to be much more complex for, let's say, cereals, for instance.
And what do the sort of standards look like and the uniformity of, I don't know, something like organic food? We see a little badge or we see something that's been certified in whichever region you live in. Does anything exist like that for regenerative agriculture? And do you see that happening in the near future?
Well, actually, that's an excellent question, and in particular because your base assumption is actually not exactly right. For organic food, there are a lot of different labels that exist. And for instance, farmers, they were on strike a few months ago, and basically they were against the fact that there are different labels. In Europe, labels for organic food are extremely strict, while we are also selling, so it's competing with organic products, for instance, from South America, where those labels are much less strict and much less. So for organic, there are several different standards. As the consumer, you don't really realize, but there are very different standards. And European standards are much, much more strict and complex and administration heavy organic food. And agriculture, regenerative agriculture is kind of more or less the same. At the moment, there are different standards. For instance, Regen Insight, we are providing our own standard for greenhouse gas emission monitoring, which is based on the leading international standard, the GHG protocol. So it's not that different from other standards. But once again, depending on what kind of models or what kind of data or even what kind of digital representation of the farm you're going to use, because before using a model, you need to collect the data and make a digital representation of the farm that you're going to enter in the models. So you might have slight differences in the models, depending on what I would say scientific equation they are going to be based on, etc., etc. And I think for biodiversity, it's going to be even more complex. So at the moment, there are a range of different approach. The main is, or the leading one is the GHG protocol, but even within the GHG protocol, greenhouse gas protocol, you have different ways to interpret the different rules and methodologies. But this is the European Union is kind of stepping in the game, and we're expecting from the CRCF, which is going to be the carbon directive for carbon certificates in Europe, or at least a public one from the European Commission. And it's going to edit some strict rules about how do we account different things like the baseline, etc., etc. But it's very technical, and there are different standards that exist, different levels of quality. But it's also emerging, and we need to give the ecosystem the time to keep improving as well.
So I want to bring the conversation back to data, and specifically things like MRV, and making sure the data we get is accurate, but also making sure that we're not putting too much pressure on these farmers. For example, if they don't know how to adapt to a new methodology, or they don't know how to collect the data that we're asking for, how do we make it an easy process for them, and how have you broach that sort of challenge in your role?
That's an excellent question, and this is the key thing we've been working on. How do we make it easily available for the farmers, while, and which is I would say one of the constraints, create trust, because any kind of financing scheme, not only in, I would say, sustainability, any kind of financing scheme is based on trust. This is extremely important. And if we create financing schemes, we need to create the trust in the facts, in the data that we provide, and in the fact that the farmers have indeed implemented the different practices that they are registering, that they are declaring they are doing. So the trust and the data is extremely important, and that's why today one of the most important barriers for farmers to engage in regenerative agriculture and be paid is the administrative burden that is attached to it. The way we managed this is through working on what we call in the startup ecosystem product. So basically, it's the online platform and the user experience to make sure it is as smooth as possible, as quick as possible, as understandable for the farmers who are not the most, I would say, digital friendly population. Some of them are, but most of them aren't. And we've really worked on how can we guide the process as much as possible, use and frame the different steps as the data in a way that meets the way they conceive their own projects and their own farming technical approach. So we've been working on that, and we've been working on what kind of data sets are already existing to try to go as fast as possible. And for instance, we're using the CAP, Common Agriculture Policy, files that the farmers already have to pre-fill a lot of data within our system. And once we've done that, we are trying to ask the minimum number of questions and in a way that meets the data that they have and meets also the way they frame their own farming world and their own farming situation. Because we see that a lot of platforms or a lot of administration systems asking for data that the farmers don't exactly have, or frame it in a way that farmers do not really match the way farmers are projecting their own farming system. So farmers have to make calculations all the way to actually be able to find the data point that is being asked from the data they already have. So what we are asking is the data that the farmers use, and then we make the calculation. And obviously, if all of this is automated, there are less errors possible as well when we make those calculations than if they had to make it themselves on paper.
Sure, and that makes sense about sort of minimizing the burden and the onus on the actual on the farmer to sort of navigate the product and put the effort in.
And I forgot to mention, but that's really important. We've met our ambition, and we now are able. It took us more than 2 years of work to be able to reach that user experience, but now we are able to onboard farmers in less than 1 hour. And I think we are the only platform that farmers can use autonomously and that they can use in so little time. So from that point, we are really strong, but it took us more than 2 years of work only on this. How do we get farmers to use our digital platform?
So talk me through some of the challenges when you are building a product. I mean, for me, it sounds like it could potentially be easier because you're not dealing with people who are used to like a specific. I mean, if they're non like technical, they're not super digitally active. These sort of people. I mean, I guess they're not used to one particular product or one particular UI UX. You're starting clean. Does that make it easier, or does it make it a lot harder?
It makes it much harder, actually. I believe when we started, we were the first in Europe to propose that kind of value proposition, that kind of approach. I remember talking to farming cooperatives and explaining what regenerative agriculture was, which was insane. I was not coming from agriculture myself. So it was, we had to take a lot of time to explain how it worked, what we're aiming to do, why it was important, what were the underlying benefits for the farmers, etc., etc. So no, it took a lot of efforts to get people to understand what we were doing, and it took us a really long while to find as well a balance because we are connecting on one side the farmers and on the other side the carbon markets, and trying to find the price point where each of them were ready to speak with each other, find how we were going to create trust, how we were going to verify the data, where we could collect that data, how did the farmers think, etc., etc. So basically, we had to design from scratch an entire system that brings together a lot of different expertise from greenhouse gas monitoring and different methodologies, UX, carbon finance, satellite imagery, agronomy, and at the same time find an economic balance between what the farmers want and what the carbon buyers want. So we had to design a system that was actually bring all those pieces together in a way that it worked. And this was extremely long, extremely hard.
Is that one of the major ways to overcome the financing barrier is through the issuance of any sort of carbon instrument or carbon commodity as a way to get money to these farmers to deploy new regenerative schemes, because then it makes sense to them if they can understand that someone's paying them to do it. Is that a way to sort of make that easier to understand for them?
Well, I think there are different ways we can frame the problem, and depending on how we frame the problem, we might come to a different solution. We can consider that the food that we buy belongs to the customer that's eating it. So maybe the customer should be paying for, I would say, the environmental premium of some products. Another way to look at it is the food companies that are buying products from the farms are benefiting from a lower carbon footprint, so they should be paying. We can consider that it's the wider society that is benefiting from the climate impact of low carbon agriculture, so it might be the government or any kind of public entity. Or another way to look at it is to say that some companies, and that's the whole concept of net zero that we are aiming for by 2050. Net zero is by 2050, we need every positive emission to be offset by a negative emission. So basically a removal from the atmosphere, and agriculture soils who have the capacity to actually absorb carbon from the atmosphere are going to be the largest natural carbon sink by 2050. They are going to contribute to 30% of our removal needs. And one way to frame it, and that's the way we are currently working on, or the main way we're developing, is to connect companies that have positive emissions. So for instance, consulting companies, once they've cut through their travels by plane, it's hard to cut further. Marketing companies, for instance, IT companies, it's hard to reduce with the existing infrastructure. It's hard to reduce below a certain level. And one way to frame it is to say, well, those companies that want to move towards net zero and have positive emissions might finance the negative emissions and the absorption of carbon by the soils. So there are, and I think the final solution is in between all of them. And at the moment, we've tried different things. We've tried supply chain based price premiums for regenerative crops, and it's either the food or the final consumer that is paying. I think the government is working in different countries on potential subsidies, including this in the Common Agriculture Policy, for instance, in Europe. And as well, carbon certificates that connects companies with positive emissions and that want to move towards net zero with the farming ecosystem. And I think the final solution is going to be a mix of all of these. But at the moment, the maturity level of the industry and the existing infrastructure can only do it case by case. But hopefully in the future, we are going to be able to connect all of those cases and bring more financing to the farms.
What is the methodology? What's the approval process for getting regenerative agriculture accepted as a carbon removal method? Did that take a long time? I imagine you were the only person working on that. Probably were other. It might not have even been you directly, but I know when it comes to creating a new sequestration method, when it comes to like those carbon credit agencies like Verra or something, it's quite a lengthy process to get that approved, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Maybe for the people who are listening us, I'll provide a bit of context around the question. But basically for carbon certificates, what I was talking about, connecting on one side companies that want to be net zero and removal providers, you need to certify what we call carbon certificates. And the idea is to say we can connect directly the financing for those carbon certificates to the attached removals, and then the claim of those removals can be made by the companies that have financed it. So that's a very relevant way, if not abused, and there are a lot of abuse, unfortunately, in the space, a lot of scandals. It's improving, but whatever. There are a few scandals. But it's a very efficient way to finance those removals that are absolutely necessary to reach net zero by 2050. And within that ecosystem, the way you generate carbon certificates are through a certification body that's within a certain methodology, and after audits from independent parties is going to accept a project and the amount of carbon that has been saved, which must be conservative, must be permanent, additional, etc., etc. But basically is going to accept those carbon removals and generate the carbon certificates as the trusted body to say, okay, your claim is based on methodology that respects, etc., etc., and a number of criteria. And within that ecosystem, there are different frameworks with different methodologies, depending on who are the frameworks. And there are different layers of certification body. But let's say there are the methodology holders, the project developers that are going to develop the projects within those methodologies, and independent auditors that are going to audit the projects. You say, okay, I've seen that it actually respects the methodology. And for the methodology, you've got different players. Verra, Gold Standard are the two biggest ones to date. They are private entities. You've got as well national frameworks, such as the Label Bas Carbone in France, and soon the CRCF, probably by 2026, 2027 in Europe. And all of those are going to provide methodologies about how do you account for croplands, how do you account for forestry, how do you account for this and this and this and this. And our own pathway was to try to implement the French label bas carbone. We are a French company, as you can guess from my accent. And we initially wanted to implement the label bas carbone, came to the conclusion that one, the administrative burden on the farms was way too heavy, which is unfortunately very often the case with the French administration. And to a certain extent, we felt that the quality of the methodology and the guarantees that are provided to the certificate buyers were not strong enough. And we didn't find in Vera or Gold Standard a method that was very applicable to agriculture. So the only solution we had was to design our own methodology within Regen Insight, and that's also why we separated on one side Rize, which is our project development activity, and Regen Insight, which is our methodology, scientific, and MRV activity, monitoring, reporting, verification activity, basically the tech infrastructure. And we've been working on improving the legitimacy of that methodology through different pathways. The first one is getting certified or getting our MRV, our technology being certified by the label bas carbone. So we are compatible with the label bas carbone. Although we don't use their methodology, the tool is being compatible, we could use them. Second, getting audited externally as being compliant with the leading international standards for greenhouse gases accounting. So basically the methodology itself. So that's the ISO 1464 and the GHG protocol that applies to us, two different standards. And now we are looking into the carbon certificate ecosystem, because above Vera and Gold Standard, there are some entities that have also accredited them, namely the ICRA, and soon the ICVCM is gonna be live.
And there's ratings agencies as well, like B0
Yes.
and REN. They talk about like the quality of the actual credit itself. So that's a whole
Yes.
other layer to the conversation.
That's yes. I didn't want to go into so many details.
No, it's okay.
But yes, there are a lot of problems with, especially old methodologies, and in particular, non-deforestation methodologies that have been heavily criticized for a really long time. It's important for the general public comprehension as well, understanding that those methodologies were best in class when they were written, but they were written in the early 2000s. So now they are being pointed out as being greenwashing, etc., etc. But when they were written, they were actually a significant breakthrough. The only problem is they've not been revised since, and I would say the general understanding has been improving. But yeah, there are rating agencies for making sure that methodologies that are not going fast enough are actually not helping project developers that just want to play the system and just work by the rule and kind of abuse those methodologies to go through. But there are and there are plenty of other players in the ecosystem, brokers, etc., etc. The ecosystem is extremely complex. Yeah. But the most important thing is indeed trust, and that's why there are some rating agencies. This is finance.
So I mean, that's the kind of crux of the issue, isn't it? It's like there are two worlds, finance and nature. What do you think about the financialization of it as a commodity? Do you think that has like value? I mean, recently I saw somebody from B0 post that they now had their quality ratings, for example, inside the Bloomberg terminal, which is, you know, what all those like investment bankers and traders use to like identify different stocks, commodities to buy and sell. And I just find that so fascinating. Is like we've gone from a way to finance projects, and now people are like trading off the back of this stuff. Do you think that's a positive or a negative for the whole ecosystem and just for the world in general?
I think it is. Finance initially has been invented to provide funds where they are needed. And I think to that extent, and the different layers of trading, pre-financing, speculation, to a certain extent is a positive thing. The problem is, once again, when people use it for just profits and don't bring anything to the ecosystem. So there is a layer of speculation, for instance. If projects are not being pre-financed by someone, they wouldn't happen. They just wouldn't happen. So this is the good side of speculation. Some people are going to take the risk. They are going to pre-finance. They are going to provide the money. Then projects are going to emerge. And different layers of different financial instruments have their role to play in climate finance. And this is, I think, a positive thing. The question around carbon is more, has all carbon the same price and the same value? You were asking the question of, does this have value? It does have value, that's for sure. The question is more about fairness. And unlike euros or pounds or any type of money, carbon is not exactly fungible. Depending where your carbon comes from, it has extremely different characteristics, and the price is going to be different for every project based on potential natural co-benefits or absence of co-benefits for technological removals, for instance, social co-benefits as well. Permanence is an important thing. That's one of the weak points of agriculture, for instance, compared to forestry. When do you consider that your carbon is permanent? Is a tree that is going to last between 80 and 150 years is considered as being permanent? There are different questions around the different types of carbon that are being traded, and there are a lot of questions, but we are at the start of an ecosystem. And I think it's important to provide the financing for those projects that are extremely important for a long-term humanity well-being, that a financial ecosystem is being created around how do we finance, how do we launch, how do we monitor, how do we create, and how do we give nature to value. That's I'm taking another line here, but diverging a bit. But one of the problems of our current society is that in the economic models that are being used at university, at our governments, etc., we don't take into account the value of nature that is being destroyed by human activity. And I think restoring the real price and the real economic value of nature is extremely important. The problem, which is always a problem with any kind of a financial scheme, is how do we avoid abuse or people profiting from the system, and how do we avoid as well, this is the case for I would say mainstream finance, how do we ensure we don't dehumanize finance the way it has happened for
dehumanize in terms of, the people working there?
No, I mean that I have a bank account, and my bank account is paying me some interest, and I don't even know where that money is coming from. I just know that every year I'm getting my interest, and as a consumer, I'm expecting my interest to fall every year, etc., etc. And I don't really know what's the system behind it. But the system behind it is my bank to ensure not only they are going to pay my interest, but as well are going to make their profit and are going to pay their employees, their system, etc., etc., is going to finance different types of activities through different types of financial instruments. And out of those instruments, they are going to finance some new oil rigs or some new oil exploration or any kind of brown activities alongside green activities, etc. But the only thing that at every, I would say, layer of the system is how much money am I making? What is my interest rate? What is my yield, my return? And this creates those so many layers, so many instruments, so many people, makes that I have no idea that actually I am the one eventually financing the the oil industry, extremely indirectly, but all of those layers make that at every step, the entire system is looking for returns. And that's what I mean by dehumanizing. I mean, what we are doing is extremely important for the world. We are creating infrastructures for the farmers to engage confidently and to finance the transition of agriculture towards regenerative agriculture. And we are struggling sometimes to finance the company. And if people understood what they were financing, and there wasn't this dehumanization of, oh, this is how much return I'm expecting, etc., etc. I think we would be an extremely priority investment for everyone. So that's what I mean. When it comes to investors, they are just looking for return, and this is unfortunately the way it works.
Do you think yields, returns, etc., can ever, yields of regenerative finance, that is, match those of something, either ambivalent towards the planet or actively harmful? Do you think we can ever get to that point when there's such a demand for carbon credits that will actually be the case?
There are still a lot of questions on how will the ecosystem evolve. What's absolutely sure is that if we want to reach net zero, we'll need to offset every positive emission by a negative emission. So it must exist in one way or another. The question is, how will it exist? What's going to be the underlying economic system? But we need to learn how to engage farmers. We need to learn how to reduce their carbon emissions, remove carbon with soils. We need to learn how do we create reliable information and prove that those emission reductions and carbon capture are real. And these are things that we need to solve. And the question of the economic system within which it's going to be embedded is kind of still unclear. So we are testing different approach. Carbon certificates is one way. That's kind of it's working at the moment. Is it the way it's going to be done tomorrow? I'm really not sure. But in any case, it's extremely important that we build the different pieces in the ecosystem, because financing is just one small part of the problem, actually.
You've been building this for 5 years now, did you say?
Yeah.
So obviously you will have had a number of, I mean, from the surface, it looks like, it's incredibly successful. No one can really look back and see the failures you will have inevitably gone through, the hurdles you would have overcome. Can you just go over some of like the toughest points for you when you were building the company and what you learned from that? And I guess that's just really helpful for those who want to build in this space or build anything really.
Thanks for the question, and maybe I'll take a step back from your question and question the underlying assumptions. Like every other startup, we are sharing a lot on our successes, etc. And I think what we've done is absolutely amazing. But the reality is, it's hard. It's always hard, and until you reach profitability, it's hard, and you keep facing new challenges that you need to solve. And in particular, for the past 2 years, the VC market has been really, really slow, and a lot of startups, not only us, and in particular in industries like sustainable development or agriculture, which are not the most VC attractive sectors, have been suffering a lot. So we see a lot of our peers as well that don't get the chance to deploy the ambitions and the projects that they were initially aiming for. And we had a slowdown for the past 2 years because we have some difficulties to secure funding. But VC markets are going to come back into shape and are going to be stronger, I expect, as soon as late this year, 2024. So I'm expecting everyone's ambition will raise again and we'll be able to accelerate again. So that's one thing. But coming back to your initial question, I think on our side, what was extremely complex was we were basically being inspired by a number of companies that were doing this in the US in different ways that were not exactly adapted to the European context either. But we got inspired by some first carbon certificate schemes, namely launched by Indigo and Nori in the US, with business models that were interesting and very inspiring. And we were bringing that to the European continent. So we were struggling a lot because we spent an insane amount of time talking to different counterparts and just evangelizing the market. So talking to the agriculture market and say, this will possibly exist. Do you want to try it? Talking to investors, I had a lot of discussions with investors, and I had a lot of returns like, what you guys are doing is never going to work. This is never going to happen. And eventually it happened. But we had to talk to a lot of different people and really explain what we were doing, et cetera, et cetera. So we had to push mountains, being the first, not alongside players, I think were 3 or 4 companies kind of launching more or less at the same time with different DNA, so very different approach. But we had to design and make sense of the whole value chain, from talking to the farmers through a digital platform, online platform, up to measuring the carbon, verifying the carbon, certifying the carbon, and selling that to someone that wants to buy it. So we had to make sense and create the whole value chain and explain how it worked while it was extremely new, and people were just like, you guys are fools, it's never going to work.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine starting in such a nascent space, and like every single conversation you have has to be an explanation. I mean, most startups are not building in an environment that nobody understands. I mean, maybe can you like go into that just a little bit more? Like, how did you not get demoralized, feeling like you're up against such a massive challenge? Like, how did you stay motivated? You know, even just stay sort of mentally healthy. Like, it sounds like quite a big thing to go through.
Well, that's a good question. To be totally honest, I've been very near the burnout probably 5 times over the past 5 years, and in particular of a period of 2 years where I hit the red line several times. That's actually a good question. You need the right amount of belief in what you're doing. Not only belief in your company, but belief in what you do. And I think that the mission of the company, basically enabling the farmers in their transition, was extremely important, because I knew, not today, but in century or 2, what we're doing is saving lives, probably thousands and maybe even millions of lives. And that's one thing that kept me working, going through the tunnel into the dark. Yeah, and this was extremely important. So believing in the project, believing in my team, believing in the fact that this is going to be necessary, and even if the company fails, we've drawn a way that other will follow, and that we are preparing the agriculture ecosystem to that transition, and we are developing things that are going to be most needed in the future. And this was extremely important to my well-being. Yeah, this is the thing that held me in the dark.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense, and it kind of leads into. I know we're coming up on time, so I'm just going to do maybe 2 more questions. Having spent so much time in this space, like I'm surely you will have identified things that still need to be improved. Like, do you think there's any key areas that still need to be built on within agriculture or regenerative agriculture? I mean, I'm not asking you to go and build another company, but maybe if someone's listening and they want an idea to check out, is there anything that springs to mind?
Oh, well, I think even on, we are just at the beginning. We are just at the beginning. everything we do is currently done to the best of our abilities and to the best of the resources we could invest in each of those areas. But there are still thousands of things that needs to be clarified, not only on the carbon value chain, financing or looking for finances can definitely be improved. MRV systems can be improved. Digitalization can be improved. Verification can be improved. And that's only for the carbon certificate value chain. I think traceability of data up to the end consumer is going to be extremely important. Now we are reaching the phase where the data at the farm level is qualitative enough. And now we need to be able to provide food companies with cohorts of farms analytics. There are many things that can be done here. And if we step outside of, I would say, the carbon value chain, on the agronomic side, there are plenty of things to be done. Substitute fertilizers, new agronomic ways to reduce carbon, etc., etc. Measurement of biodiversity. We've started working on biodiversity as well, but biodiversity has an insane economic value. The question is, how do we make this happen? There are thousands of things that can be done in the agriculture ecosystem. And maybe talking about the different ways, coming back to your first question today, regenerative agriculture is just part of the way, but that can't be the sole solution. We will need to find other ways to keep reducing the environmental footprint of farming after regenerative agriculture. So regenerative agriculture is not the end of the line, and we will need to keep improving.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's never just one industry or one concept that can drive all the change that's required. So yeah, I definitely agree there. And then I lied about only there being 2 more questions left, but I have something. I guess, could you offer just like any general advice to somebody who wants to build either specifically in agri-tech or regenerative agriculture, or then more broadly just in climate? I mean, what's something you wish you knew when you were going to start out?
Well, very specific to our current context is when someone gives you money, take it. Because, yeah, but this is very specific to our current context. It was hard to finance a company for the past few years, so we had to slow down significantly our development, etc., etc. It's going to restart, I think, late this year, and we've refused really big checks at some point because we're just like, oh, the valuation is not right. We want a better valuation, blah, blah, blah. And we were, I would say, on really strong dynamic for something like 6 months. And then there was the VC crisis. And then it was harder to secure money. So I should have taken the money when it was on the table. That's one thing. But if I come back to the very beginnings, there is a strong belief, or at least in the common imagination, you wake up with an idea and you're going to develop your idea and that's going to be your company. That's not how entrepreneurship works. In 99% of the cases, you wake up one day and you're just like, this is the right time for me. I'm going to become an entrepreneur, but I have no idea what I'm going to do. And then you're just like, okay, I like this. So I'm going to call my friends, or I'm going to call my network, or someone I don't know outside of my network. I'm going to call some experts to try to understand what are their problems as regards this specific issue. And I'm going to try to imagine a first idea or first startup. And then I'm going to bring it to those users that I intended, and I'm going to be like, oh, what are your problems? Okay, that's not exactly what I had in mind, and this is what I have imagined I would develop. And they're going to be like, that's cool. Everyone is going to tell you that your idea is cool, but they are going to kind of let you know that this is not exactly what they need, and that actually if you could work on that instead, that would be better. And basically, it's this kind of a very iterative process that's going to lead you to your company. So from my personal experience, it took us 10 months to come to the initial idea that turned into Rize and to identify agriculture as the playing field we would take. But the initial idea was, I'm going to create a bank. I had 5 years of career in finance. I'm going to launch a bank that's going to invest its users' money in green projects. And that's the initial idea I had. And then I went along the path of, basically there were two options here. Either I would go along the bank line. Okay, I'm going to create a green bank. Maybe my idea was not exactly the best idea, but whatever. Or either, I can finance green projects. And then you dig into green projects and you're just like, carbon certificates. What's this? There are a lot of scandals into this, and people are looking to make things better. And I believe we could make things better. What's the first thing that we could look at? Okay, forestry looks simple from the outside, and then you look into forestry, and after a while, you're just like, actually, I'm going to apply carbon certificates to agriculture because it's new, because it's complex, etc., and I feel I can do it. And that's kind of the whole. And in between, we've looked at building renovation. We've looked at the circular economy of raw materials. We've looked at so many different ideas, but this was really an iterative process. We didn't wake up one morning and be like, okay, we're going to make Rize, and Rize is going to make carbon credits in agriculture. No, it took us a long way, talking to a lot of people, testing ideas, looking into the scientific world as well for different equations that we could apply to monitor carbon at the farm level, looking at what was being done in the US. The US is often a great source of inspiration, and looking at the farming ecosystem, and we had to talk to a lot of different people, and it took us a really, really long while to end up doing Rize.
I'm curious, with the climate bank idea, the commercial bank idea, did you just realize that there are regulatory challenges involved? I mean, I know becoming a bank is very difficult, or was that just another reason you decided to pivot away from that idea?
No, actually, it's not as difficult as we could think. There are what we call BaaS, banking as a service, if I'm correct, which are basically banks that already exist, that already have the accreditation, etc., and that are going to provide you with the backbone of what is a bank. So you're not going to be a bank yourself, but you're just going to be painting. You're going to be the cover, the UX on top of that infrastructure that is being provided by those players. And basically, you can launch very quickly a bank without really going through all of that. And just by providing something that is different, that is new, and differentiating from the rest of the ecosystem. So now the green bank kind of segment, there was 2 companies, at least in France, that launched exactly like a few months after I had and started to explore that idea, and those 2 banks are still running. So it wasn't that bad of an idea, but that's just not the idea that I decided to pursue.
Yeah, it wasn't the fit. That makes sense. So I guess then, how can I help you, and how can anyone who's listening to this help you? I'll turn this into a little clip and I'll post it. What's the best way to support you in your work?
Well, since our business is so specific to, on one side, the net zero ecosystem, companies contributing by financing farmers, and on one side, the farming ecosystem, I think one way to contribute would be just to be more aware about agriculture, and trying to look at what you eat, where it comes from, its carbon footprint, etc., that would probably be the best way for the general public to help, just being more aware and being ready, maybe to pay a few more cents for a product that is of higher quality, and that's, by the way, is going to be probably better for your health anyway. So it's also a gesture towards yourself. And maybe we are probably going to launch a crowdfunding in the very coming month. So if you want to contribute, that's also one opportunity for you to help us.
Yeah, interesting. And if that's live by the time this is posted, I'll put it in the description. Obviously, disclaimer. Obviously, that's not suggestion or indication of
Yeah,
how that's going to go. But
that's
obviously, I'll
if you
just
want
put
to
our
have.
show down there. As
You
well as
can
I'll
have.
also put all
Yeah.
of Etienne's and Regen Insights and Rise's socials in and links in the description. So if you do want to check that out, then feel free to do so. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap. So, Etienne, obviously, thank you so much for coming and sharing your insights and your knowledge on the podcast. That's really, really helpful for me to get someone who knows about regenerative agriculture for a long time. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.